Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome to Clearer Than Truth. I'm host Nathan Kiker, and our guest today is historian Michael Auslin. Mr. Auslin is a former professor of history at Yale. He's also an award-winning historian, a longtime contributor to the Wall Street Journal, and one of the nation's foremost experts on global grand strategy, and the author of the new book, National Treasure, about the Declaration of Independence. As we approach the country's 250th anniversary, Michael joins us to talk about the incredible, perilous, physical journey of the Declaration of Independence and why its ideals remain our ultimate North Star in a deeply fractured world. Michael, great to have you.
Good morning.
So, what drew you to write a full history of the Declaration of Independence as a living object and not just a founding text?
Honestly, I wanted to read a book on it. And there's a backstory. I was at the National Archives, and I live in Washington, but I hadn't gone and seen the document for a while, or into the rotunda to see the what they call the Charters of Freedom. And this was 2 years ago, and I was standing in front of it, and all of a sudden, I honestly, I sort of felt like a kid again. I don't know why, but that sort of sense of awe and wonder, and as a professional historian, you can become pretty jaded pretty quickly. But for some reason, I'm looking at this and the Parchment Declaration, and it just filled me with such interest. And I had been talking to some folks telling me some stories about the Declaration at the archives, and so I went to get a book. And they didn't have one. And so I did my due diligence, and I discovered, honestly, I'm still sort of shocked by it. No one had ever written a complete history of the Declaration from 1776 to the 21st century and tried to look at all of its different manifestations. So usually they treat it, and very rightfully as, this great document of ideas, which it is, and try to understand, who influenced Thomas Jefferson and when did Abraham Lincoln, first encounter it, and so on and so forth, all of which I think is critically important in the book. But, I remember being a kid and putting up crinkly copies of the Declaration on my wall. I remember seeing just weird merch on the Declaration, right? Yeah, like plates and baseball caps and coins, and no one had really told the story of how all of that came about. And this was 2 years ago, and then I realized, well, we're about to hit the 250th, and so I just jumped in, and that's how it happened.
Well, what is the story of the Declaration? People sort of know the ideal version. Everyone gathers in Philly. They're tired of the Brits. And then they say, we want our own government. We're leaving England. What actually happened before we dive into what happened after as a living document?
Well, in essence, that is what happened. Although there's two things I would mention. The first is that, the Americans, they didn't want a war, right? How are you going to defeat the most powerful country on earth, the most powerful empire? Nor did they want to leave the empire. They were proud Englishmen in North America. What they were angry about was they felt that their rights were being taken away. And so even after Lexington and Concord, they were trying to get the British to back down and reconcile, resolve these grievances. And they sent what was called the Olive Branch Petition to King George III. And that was only, one of a number of things they'd sent. All of it was ignored. They felt behind the eight ball and pushed into a corner. And of course, you had real firebrands, right? People like Samuel Adams from Boston and Thomas Paine, who had just arrived in America. And eventually, they realize reconciliation's impossible. For many of them, it breaks their hearts. And they also know that there are tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of loyalists in the colonies that you have to figure out, what are you going to do with them? Can you swing them over to the Patriot side, or are they going to leave? And the reality is the vast majority left. But they find themselves in Philadelphia needing, first of all, having to make this decision. Will we actually become independent? Well, what does that mean? No one had done that. No one had said, we're going to form a new country. Right? Countries either were or were not. Britain was, China was, France was. So to take this step which today we take for granted, was unprecedented. So there was enormous debate over that. They finally decide to do it on July 2nd of 1776. And then they have to tell the world about it, and they have to tell Americans about it. They have to say what has been done and why, and they have to use it, again, as a way to swing support behind them. And so the irony is that the Declaration, which we venerate in this case that it's been in for 70 years, and 1 million people a year come and see it, and I've written a whole book on it, the Declaration, it wasn't an afterthought, it was an administrative task. You had to get on to the more important things because we were losing the war. So you had to get on to getting aid from foreign countries, meaning, forming alliances, but you couldn't form an alliance unless you were an independent nation. And you also had to figure out how to govern yourselves. So they were coming up with Articles of Confederation. So the Declaration really was this task that had to be done. None of them thought that 250 years later, you and I'd be sitting here talking about the parchment, its ideas, how it survived, how it inspired people. And that, I think, is just such a wonderful story in itself, in addition to how it actually survived all these years.
In high school and college, you often think about it as like the big documents are like the Magna Carta, the Constitution, the Declaration, and a couple of the others are thrown in. What was what did the founders, what documents did they draw on specifically?
Yeah, there's no question that the Declaration was an amalgam of great things that had been thought and said, both here and in England, France as well, other places. And Thomas Jefferson later in life remarked that it was not part of his job to write anything that hadn't been thought or said before, but instead to make it an expression of the American mind. And that's really what he did. Of course, he did it in his inimitable prose and his musical prose, his cadences, and his incredible way of structuring this document. But he drew on many things. He drew very largely on the English Bill of Rights of 1689, as well as philosophy from the Enlightenment, the English Enlightenment in particular, like John Locke, Scottish Enlightenment philosophers like Francis Hutcheson, Montesquieu. Montesquieu is very, very significant when we get to the Constitution, the idea of separation of powers. But they're reading all of what has been thought and said in Europe. Jefferson himself had started writing a draft of a Virginia Constitution in which he's listing charges, and he then takes those charges, which he's thinking about initially in terms of Virginia and injuries that Virginia has suffered, and then puts them into his draft to make them national and tries to link them to all of the colonies. He also takes directly almost George Mason's Virginia Bill of Rights, which had just come out as he's sitting down to start writing this draft, and then he shapes it and tightens it a little bit, which ironically he tightens George Mason, and then the Continental Congress tightens Thomas Jefferson, right? So it's an ongoing process of taking these ideas that had been said in the colonial assemblies, in the pulpits, on the streets, and turning them into this justification for rebellion. And I don't think that he or they thought of themselves as revolutionaries. They thought of themselves as conservatives, meaning they were trying to conserve their rights that they had been exercising for 150 years and above. But it had to be put in this new form, this easily understandable, acceptable, and quite, if it could be, quite inspiring piece of administrative tasks. And that's amazingly what he did.
It seems to me that Jefferson, a lot of people think Jefferson was basically assigned to write it, disappeared for a couple weeks in Philly, sat down and just knocked it out. Who else was involved in sort of the nitty-gritty of it? And what did they think of Jefferson? And do you think Jefferson was sort of showboating and using this for a longer political career?
So Jefferson, ironically, had said almost nothing in Congress up to this point. He was known for some of his writings, particularly a summary of the rights of British North America, but he was not a leader in Congress. That was the leader of the Patriot cause really was John Adams. Obviously, Ben Franklin is there to give his his avuncular advice. You have Richard Henry Lee, who actually proposes independence from Virginia. Jefferson was not seen as a leader, and in fact, of course, he didn't really want to be there. He wanted to be back home in Virginia, in Williamsburg, writing this Constitution for Virginia. But the head of the Virginia delegation also wanted to do that, so he left Philadelphia. Jefferson stepped in and then was named to this committee of five on June 11th, 1776. The committee was John Adams, Ben Franklin, Robert Livingston of New York, and Roger Sherman of Connecticut, along with Jefferson. So later in life, Jefferson and Adams actually have this indirect colloquy through letters to partisans about who's responsible for the Declaration. Adams basically takes credit for giving the pen to Jefferson and says, you're a better writer, you're a Virginian, and I'm obnoxious and people hate me, so you really should write this thing. And Jefferson, basically says, more or less, they just told me to write it and I decided to write it. What's fascinating, though, is that we don't know who did what edits to it because they didn't take any notes. And so we know that he gives it to the committee, but of the committee, Franklin has the gout, so he's not involved very much. Livingston is not in favor of independence, so he's not very involved. I think he was put on as a minority voice, probably. And Sherman is on the committee for the Articles of Confederation. So it really comes down to Jefferson and Adams. And we know that there are some important changes made. For example, the change in the first line, when it becomes necessary, or when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for a people, is what Jefferson first writes. And then it becomes one people, which I think is a critical unifying phrase. Also, we hold these truths to be self-evident as opposed to sacred and known to all. Exactly how he writes it, it changes a little over time, but then it becomes this famous phrase: we hold these truths to be self-evident. Another change may have come from Adams, may have come from Franklin. Franklin did look at it. So Jefferson is making some changes. The committee makes some, and then the Congress gets it, and then Congress really tears into it. They remove about a quarter of the document. They tighten it up. They add certain things, though, that also round it out. They add the original resolution for independence near the end, which makes a lot of sense. But they take out two of Jefferson's charges, things that really bothered him. One was a very intemperate ad hominem attack on the British people, which was taken out in part because there were so many loyalists still in the colonies, as well as the fact that they knew that even if they won the war and they maintained their independence, they would still be tied to Britain more than any other country because of language, culture, tradition, religion, social ties and the like. And so attacking all of the British people did not seem like a good idea. That was taken out. And then, of course, what wounded Jefferson most is that there was a long, passionate condemnation of the slave trade that was taken out. Something he had tried to get done in Virginia to abolish the trade, which he thought then would mean the end of slavery. Like many of the slaveholders, Washington, George Washington, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, George Mason, they all abhorred the practice and the system. They were deeply involved in it, and their wealth came from it, but they didn't know how to get out of it. What Jefferson thought in that sort of logical way was that if you could end the slave trade, you would end slavery. And in essence, they wouldn't be forced to make a choice or take actions that they weren't ready for and didn't know how they themselves could economically or quite frankly, even socially survive if they had done it. So he was hoping that, you'd push it off onto others, but the British and George were not having it. And so he puts in this very, very brutal condemnation of George and the slave trade. And that's taken out by Congress. It's the first great and first terrible compromise.
I don't want to dive into a thing about Jefferson if he was bad or not. I mean, Sally Hemings and everything else. But I would like to shift a bit to the immediate political implications of the document once it became sort of live and out there on July 4th. Originally going to be July 3rd, as we all know, but then July 4th. What was the British response and what was the response from the colonies? Was it immediately known that this was a significant event that marked the U.S. separating, or was it sort of like a painting by Van Gogh? No one realized the significance until years later.
Well, I think that, they're in the midst of this war, which the Americans are losing. The document obviously is meant to justify reaching out to other countries for the desperately needed aid. That's particularly France and then Spain, Netherlands, who can give money and the like. So I don't think necessarily that it was seen as something as revolutionary as we take it today. George had already stated that we were traitors and rebels out of his protection. Out of his protection is the way it's put at the time. There's obviously a clear break. The British also have suffered, pretty significant losses at Bunker Hill. They're doing well by the summer of 1776, but they've been very chastened, and they don't want to, they're worried about how much this could cost them to keep this war going. So they're also in a state of uncertainty and flux. Inside the colonies, again, there's a great diversity of opinion. Again, and once more, later in life, so much of what we know about this time comes from later letters that are written by the principals involved. But John Adams writes, at the time of independence, a third of Americans favored it, a third were loyalists and opposed, and a third, in good American fashion, had no opinion whatsoever. Right, whichever way it went, that's okay with them. And so it certainly wasn't, it wasn't that the case that you had, suddenly we think about sort of complete mobilization in these days, right, for a war that sort of stops society and everything goes forward. We think of World War II and conflicts like that, and in this case, you had large segments of the country that either were supporting the British overtly or were staying on the sidelines. So it wasn't that everyone suddenly got on board and said, "Wow, we're a new country," but you had throughout the colonies the assemblies, which were certainly from the British point of view, extra legal gatherings, right? They had no legal standing, but and that's where the British saw us as rebels and revolutionaries. But they were all in favor of independence because they had all instructed their delegations in Philadelphia to vote for independence. So the governing structures that were stepping in to replace British governing were all in favor, and so you sort of had this official support for independence. You had the committees of safety and committees of correspondence, all of which had been talking with each other over the past couple of years. All of these were already activated, but the Declaration sort of gives them a justification and a legitimation that they may not have had before. And quite frankly, it's a clarifying moment. They don't know if they're going to win the war, but they are now all in. And it's a clarifying moment to make this declaration, to pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to each other, to try to get all Americans on board with this project. There's no turning back at that point. And I think that's really what the Declaration does. And of course, it does go abroad. George himself never refers to it, but there are dozens of responses printed up in Britain. And all of them, by the way, ignore the stuff that we think is most important today. They ignore the statements about all men are created equal. They focus solely on the 27 charges. It's a very legalistic approach, quite frankly, on both sides. To Jefferson and the signers, the 27 charges were the heart of the document. It explained why we were doing what we did. Again, we weren't asking for our rights. We were saying we have rights that are threatened, and therefore we are taking these actions, and here we're showing you how they're threatened. Same thing in Britain, except from the other side. They would look at all 27 charges and they would say each of these is illegitimate, or they don't rise to the level of rebellion or the like. So the document is debated, and it does form this sort of extensive interchange between partisans in America and those in Britain. But did they see that it was a document that would change the world? I don't think so. What they saw is that this was at the time it appeared, a mortal threat to the empire. And this piece of paper is what, announced it. But the point was not to justify or delegitimize the Declaration itself. It was to win this war, on both sides. The Americans had to win, and the British had to win. And the Declaration was just one of these was one of the elements that went into it.
Okay. So, spoiler alert, we won the war, and then many leaders from Lincoln to Obama have pointed to it as a inspirational document that we should use to craft our ideals. I remember hearing Obama speak, and he would say stuff like, the country was founded with these ideals. We've come up short, but it's something to always be pushing towards. Weirdly, it's both a conservative argument and a liberal argument, one that like people like Jonah Goldberg use, and then again Obama use, which is, did we get everything right? No, but was it the most advanced document on sort of human rights and treating others well? Yes. Do we have to push for it? Yes. Talk to me and our listeners a bit about how other leaders have seen the document. Where do they think it came up short? Where do they think it excelled? Uh, Such as, again, Lincoln, Obama, Reagan,
it
FDR.
changes over time, and I think that's part of the fascination with the document. It is a living document, and I think it will remain living as long as we are a country, united as a country. If you look at the first 35 years or so, 40 years actually, it's actually pretty much ignored. It had done its job on July 4th, 1776, and then it's sent around the colonies. The colonies get it at different points in time during that summer, depending on how long it took the post riders to read them. It's printed in newspapers. It's printed up on these broadsides, and then people know. You don't have to keep telling them you're independent, right? And the war is still going to go on until 1782. In terms of 1781, in terms of actual combat, and then a couple of years to resolve it and get a peace treaty. So the Declaration really begins to fade from memory. Independence doesn't. People celebrate independence, but the document itself isn't talked about that much until after the War of 1812, and then suddenly it becomes seen once again as this ringing document of freedom. And when they talked about it during these years, that was really how they talked about it. They talked about it as a liberty document. This was the document that gave us our liberty. They didn't focus on the equality parts of it because they weren't at that stage of grappling with those questions. And instead, they would say this was the document that gave us liberty. And in fact, it became influential in different parts of the world. The Latin American republics are now going their own way, making their own revolutions, and they are making their own declarations of independence. And we are very aware of this and writing about, we are now a beacon of liberty to the world. They look at our lessons of how to become independent and survive as a nation, and this is a justification for this document, why it continues to be important. Also, the very fact that it physically survived the burning of Washington in 1814 lent this mythic quality to it. Don't forget, most Americans, of course, they knew there had been a declaration, and it again was printed in newspapers, was printed in early textbooks and the like. But the formal official parchment that you go and see at the National Archives, signed by Congress, almost no Americans knew that existed. That was kept as a paper of state. And in fact, the signatures themselves were kept secret until 1777. For the first 6 months, nobody even knew who signed the document. And after that, it was just as part of the Congressional Archive or part of the archive of the Department of State. But after 1814, the story gets out. It's saved in the nick of time from being burned with the White House and the State Department. And everyone says, that's amazing. What was saved? Because they didn't know that it existed. And then you have this new life begin for the Declaration in which people want to see it. They know it's there. And so you have very entrepreneurial people, a guy named John Binns, a guy named Benjamin Owen Tyler, and they make artistic reproductions. And they sell these. And they say, look, this is your birthright of freedom. Put this on your wall, and it's going to cost you, however, $20 or something like that. And it's this perfect marriage of civics and commerce, where these guys are making money, and at the same time, people are suddenly seeing the document. And then John Trumbull paints his famous portrait that goes in the rotunda, and immediately he begins selling copies. He gets it engraved, and he's selling copies. And this is wildly popular. I mean, he sells thousands and thousands of copies of this, and people are putting it up on their walls. So now they're sort of in the mindset they can bring themselves back what it looked like, even though the scene that he painted is completely fanciful. Nothing like that ever happened. Americans are saying, oh, wow, this is what it was like in Independence Hall when they were declaring independence or voting on the Declaration. And then the final part of this puzzle is that John Quincy Adams, who's the Secretary of State, orders that an exact replica of the Declaration, the official parchment, be made, because already by 1820, when he decides to have this, to make this order, the parchment is faded. It's been very misused and abused. The fear is that it's actually not going to survive. They don't know how to keep it, right? They don't have a science of conservation. It's been rolled up. It's been affected by heat and humidity and temperature. It's been carted around, obviously 1814, but during the Revolutionary War, it's actually been really mishandled. And so John Quincy Adams says we need what's the equivalent of a photograph, and it takes 3 years, and it is engraved by a man named William Stone, and every copy that you see or image of the Declaration, the handwritten parchment with the signatures, comes from the stone engraving. It's released in 1823, and then suddenly Americans can see for themselves what the actual document looked like. And this creates this unending market in Declaration memorabilia that continues to today, of people buying facsimiles, buying reproductions, buying images, like John Trumbull's, which we do with no other document. And I think what it did is it brought it close to Americans in a way that again, no other piece of paper, no other statement in American history had done, and it made them think about what this Declaration was really saying, and what its broader meaning was. And in fact, in 1821, it's John Quincy Adams on the 45th anniversary who brings it to the Capitol, brings the actual original parchment, reads it to a crowd of thousands, including all of Congress, and then gives his very famous speech, we go not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. But what he does later in that speech, which people don't remember, is that for the first time at such an elevated level, he talks about the Declaration as the foundation of our constitutional system, and one that inspires the world, and really begins the transformation of it into the document that we think of today, that its phrases, all men are created equal, have this universal appeal and this eternal standing. They're not going to be repealed. They're not going to, be negated. And this is taken up by abolitionists. It's taken up by women's rights suffragists. It's taken up by people arguing for temperance, taken up by socialists. And ultimately, and I think, most importantly, it's taken up by Abraham Lincoln. It becomes the core and the centerpiece of his entire political philosophy. And it is Lincoln who, I think, fully reframes and recasts the Declaration in a way that we now fully accept, that its claim of equality is for all people at all time, in all places. And that is what ensures liberty for all of us. It's what he calls the apple of gold. And so this evolution, it takes, by 1860s, right? It's almost 90 years after the Declaration has been signed. So it takes a long time, and the evolution is very marked. But I think that alone reveals the greatness of the document, that it could be so adopted by so many different groups, all of which, by the way, were not claiming the document to separate or create an enclave or create special rights. What they wanted were, in their view, their God-given rights to be fully part of America. And so that's why when I write about it in the book, I call it our great unity document. And I think that's what it is. It is really the great statement of American unity for that one people.
Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time and share with friends.